Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story begins with one scandal. A girl named Veronica is standing in the street telling the guards that she is not going anywhere. However, one of them replies that she must obey Count Vitya's orders, or else it will be very bad. But the girl continues to insist on her point, and said that this is not disobedience in any way, but merely a refusal. She also asked that he so-and-so tell him that she was Veronica, refusing to go back there. The man, hearing these words, frowned and said that actually such behavior would bring her nothing but trouble, and she was already well aware of it. And at that moment, one of the guards suddenly grabbed a girl named Hilda. It was her personal maid. Veronica was immediately wary, and the man in turn put a knife to her neck and told her to choose. Either she would sacrifice the life of this servant girl, or quietly return with them to the Count's estate. The girl was very surprised that she was being given such a horrible choice with no choice. Hilda's neck was even starting to bleed already, because the man was bringing his sword closer and closer to her throat, so Veronica had no choice. And she said she would go back to that horrible manor. And at that moment the poor maid was finally released, and she was able to breathe normally. But the girl also knew that you can't just agree like that, so she added that she would have one condition. She asked that none of them ever touch her maids again. Soon the girl gathered herself, and all the other servants of the manor went outside to escort her. The butler, with a very sad look, apologized, and said it was all because of them. She would have to go back to that horrible manor now. However, Veronica said with a smile that it wasn't like that at all. After all, it was inevitable anyway. She asked that they take care of the place while she was gone. Everyone around them was crying. They were really sad that she was leaving. When she was about to get into the carriage, she heard someone behind her asking her to stop. Turning around, Veronica sees Hilda in front of her, who was wearing a cloak, and said that she would go with her. The girl also had a suitcase in her hands, so she was serious. As soon as the lady heard this, she was very surprised and asked the girl what she was saying. She was not yet fully recovered and dared not even think of such a thing. However, Hilda said that she was after all her maid, and so wherever the girl went, it was her duty to follow her mistress. She suddenly touched her bandaged neck, from which blood had already stopped flowing, and said that after mistress had saved her, she had decided to help her by all means. Veronica was very surprised to hear this. But then she smiled and put her arm around her maid and said that she was so stubborn. The girl had no choice, so she said she would count on her. And soon they were on their way to that horrible manor together. In fact, locked in this place by her father, she, Veronica, had suffered the worst fever about a year ago. She even thought she was dying. It was only during this terrible illness that the girl remembered a book she had read in a past life. And I realized that I had been reborn as the actual heroine of that very novel. She was the beautiful Veronica. These novels were the ones that told her story, and there were several of them. All were on the internet, and in them, the girl was treated very cruelly. Her father, and even the servants. Count Schumann didn't want to listen to his daughter at all and called her names all the time. He was the villain behind all of poor Veronica's problems. He always said that his daughter was not worth even a drop of his time, and even beat her, taking out all his anger on the girl. After a man drove his dear wife to her death and stole her entire fortune, he used his daughter, Veronica, in marriage transactions without stopping the abuse. However, it may seem surprising, but Veronica, along with the two suitors who were chosen by her father for a political marriage, was able to get out of this nightmare at last. She was torn right such that the two of them, but then eventually chose the one. It seemed to her that a happy ending was soon awaiting her. But in the end, at the end of the road, only death awaited her. There was no happiness in sight. She was bleeding, and he even mocked her. The man believed that if she wasn't his, no one should have her, and that's why he brutally murdered her. And after that, the lovely Veronica was no longer allowed on the forums of the internet. The murderer was never revealed, and everyone thought it was one of the two main male characters, which means that a girl's association with them could put her life in danger. Now that she's living in this world. The girl was thinking about all this again, and did not immediately notice Hilda addressing her. And after a while she finally heard and immediately turned to the maid. She in turn looked out of the window in surprise and said that they had some kind of trouble with the carriage. In fact, they even stopped. Veronica immediately went outside and asked the man who was escorting them what had happened and why they were standing. The knight looked at her and replied that one of the horses lay down from exhaustion, so they would have to wait until she recovered. The girl was a little surprised at this, but said that in that case they had more time. Then she turned to Hilda and suggested that they go for a little walk. The maid didn't really like the idea. However, she still agreed, and as soon as they stepped outside, they noticed the knight's bawdy gaze. Veronica, smiling, said he needn't worry. They wouldn't go far because there was no escape from this place anyway, so there was no point in worrying. He still didn't like the idea and said he didn't trust her definitively. However, the girl could go. After all, indeed, they had stopped for a long time for sure. After a while, Veronica and her maid were walking through the forest, and the girl said that the place was incredibly good, and it was very stuffy in the carriage. Veronica agreed with her, and said that indeed this beautiful summer breeze gives a sense of life and freedom. But at that moment, Hilda suddenly stopped, and said that she had forgotten her umbrella. The girl immediately began to assure her that she did not need it, but the maid insisted, saying that she could not go without it, because it was an indispensable thing for a lady. So she immediately ran back to the carriage to get it, and said she would be back quite soon, asking that the lady wait for her. Veronica was alone. She stood in the middle of the road and, closing her eyes, felt the slight breeze that carried the scents of grass. It was very comforting, even though she knew she was returning to a terrible place. The very next day they are to arrive at the estate where Count Schumann lives, who does not put his own daughter in anything, and does not want to accept the fact that she has her own life. The memories of her past life have no bearing on what she's like right now. When she read the story, she felt compassion and even some connection and anger. Losing the family you depend on, living a life of abuse, all of which the girl had felt even in her past life. And like the heroine of the novel, she decided that she couldn't live like this anymore. So she was going to do everything she could to make sure that the ending that Veronica couldn't have in the book, she could get. And it would be perfect. She was about to walk a little farther, just to avoid standing still waiting for Hilda, when suddenly she heard some strange noises nearby. The girl immediately started looking around, not realizing what the sounds she had just heard were. Soon afterward they came again, and when she went into the bushes, she saw that it was a little dog that had been caught in a snare and squawked. The girl was very much afraid for his life. She ran at once and did not understand how one could be so wicked as to set traps for unfortunate and defenseless animals. But just as she was about to crouch down and help him out, she suddenly heard some male voices behind her. They approached the girl, one of them saying he thought some idiot had fallen into a trap and the whole day had gone to shit. Apparently, however, it wasn't. As soon as they saw the girl, they immediately began to look at her greedily and lick like animals. And one of the hunters said that apparently they were able to catch a pretty big win. Veronica just stared at them angrily, not saying a single word. She realized that this was not going to end well. The men in turn laughed and told her not to worry, but to follow their instructions, and then she would definitely not get hurt. Then Veronica decided to act quickly, she unlatching the trap with a flick of her hand, and the dog was able to get out. The girl looked at him and started screaming, telling him to run away as soon as possible, for they might hurt him. The animal looked at her pitifully and did nothing but stand still. Then one of the hunters started to approach Veronica, saying that she had such a tender heart, and also had a nice appearance. He smiled wickedly, and also added that it might even be useful to them. But at that moment he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his leg. When he looked down, he saw that it was the dog clinging to his ankle. The boy was very surprised at this. He immediately started waving his leg for the dog to get away from him, but it was useless. He said that since the animal had decided to bite him, he would take double revenge, and started to reach for his axe to chop off its head. As soon as Veronica saw it, she immediately started screaming and asked him to stop because the animal was not guilty of anything. But after that, things happened pretty fast. The man who was about to kill the poor dog suddenly began to bleed because the arrow had gone through his body. He started screaming loudly, all because his shoulder was hurt, and even slumped to the ground, unable to say anything else. Veronica watched it all in surprise, and the other hunter immediately ran up to his partner and asked who was there and whose arrow it was. At that moment, a blonde-haired man appeared from the bushes and said that since they were so anxious to know, he had come outside and said it was him. As soon as Veronica saw him, she immediately remembered the ending that awaits her. The girl thought that most likely this guy had killed her and was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He, in turn, paid no attention to the girl for a while, but turned to the hunters, saying that it was rather brave of them to come this far, and this stranger had soft honey blonde hair and eyes like warm sunlight. His name was Lowen Zyle Adrian, and this man was the main character in the novel the girl was reading, as well as the crown prince of the Adrian Empire. He came closer to the hunter and asked how he even dared to touch his dog. The girl realized that this man was also her potential killer. The hunter then said that he had attacked their boss and wondered if the guy really thought he could handle them alone. But Lowen, smiling, replied that he had never once said he was a loner. He glared at the ruffians and wondered if they even knew whose property this was. When he saw their surprised faces, he explained that they would pay for their nefarious deeds on his lands. Then the hunter turned to his partner and said that the man must be the owner of the place. They immediately realized that they were in big trouble, so they started to run away, saying that they would not go near the area again. Lowen then walked over to Veronica and, holding out his hand to help her up, asked if she was hurt. The girl, without taking her eyes off him, replied that she was all right. When the man, smiling, said that it was only because of her that their baby was safe. The girl wondered who he was talking about, and the man replied that it was the name of his dog that she had rescued. Veronica immediately shifted her gaze to the animal while she realized that she needed to get out of this place, and as soon as possible, before things got even weirder. Just as she was about to get to her feet and leave, she suddenly heard Hilda's worried voice behind her. She even had tears in her eyes. She ran up to the lady and inquired if she was all right, for she had heard the screams, then turned her eyes to the man who stood beside her and asked, "Did he do something to her?" Veronica immediately replied that not at all. She need not worry, for this stranger, on the contrary, had saved her from terrible villains. By then, the guards had already run up, turning to Lady Veronica and asking what had happened this time. He, seeing that she was absolutely fine, said that she wasn't even hurt, but that the maid was overreacting. The other in turn began to resent it, saying that he had told her not to go far, hadn't he? After all, any injury could bring a lot of trouble to His Highness. Veronica was very angry, but replied that she understood and that it would not happen again. She thought to herself at that moment that she was nothing more than a commodity to them. She was about to leave, but suddenly Lowen grabbed her by the cloak and said that he apologized. Looking her straight in the eye, the man asked if he could accompany her until they got out of this forest, for there might still be various bandits lurking around. The girl smiled softly and thanked him and told him it wasn't necessary, for her guards would take care of that condition. After that, she followed Hilda and said that she had to go now. She could not linger, so she said goodbye to the man. Yes, not reaching the wagon, the knight opened the door for her, telling her that they needed to hurry. After all, they were already behind schedule. Lowen, who remained standing in the forest, kept thinking about what this girl's name was. He had heard of someone addressing her as Veronica, so he remembered it immediately. After some more time, his personal guard suddenly came running to him. One of the boys immediately asked him if he was all right and if he was hurt. Another said that they had detected some suspicious individuals not far from here, but as soon as they got closer to His Highness, they were surprised to ask what was wrong with him, for he stood with a puzzled expression on his face. Lowen was silent for a while. Then he pointed toward the exit of the woods and asked that they find out to which family this coat of arms that was on top of the carriage belonged. Soon the wagon finally departed, and they arrived at the Grayson home by the following evening after all. As soon as the doors opened, Hilda was very surprised at such an interior, for everything around was so grand and rich that her eyes even began to run wild. Veronica herself at that moment thought about the fact that she was back in this creepy place. They went on their way, and the maid wondered why they were not met by any of the workers of the house. She was really very surprised. Hilda wondered, are they avoiding us? Even though they knew she was coming about that time. Veronica did not know what to say to this. for she knew that the servants had no respect for her at all and thought themselves better than everyone else. But at that moment, the girls heard some shouting nearby. One of the maids started yelling at someone, saying that he had ruined her dress atrociously. As soon as Hilda and her mistress went upstairs together, they saw the maid screaming at the poor little child, asking how she was going to fix this. The girl talked about how incredibly annoyed she was by the whole thing, and asked that she immediately clean up what she had spilled. As soon as Veronica went upstairs, she immediately recognized that awful voice. It was Lucy's maid. She kept yelling at the small child, telling her to stop crying already, because it was no use anyway, and to start cleaning up right now. She kept talking about the girl working like a turtle. But at that moment she suddenly saw someone looking at them, and she immediately shifted her gaze. Lucy saw that this someone was Veronica, and with a heavy sigh, she said that apparently the lady had already returned. The girl in turn came closer to her, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and asked Lucy what it all meant and why she was acting like this. Ta, for her part, sighed heavily and began to look at her manicure and said, as she could see for herself, that Earl Grayson had adopted her. She explained that this girl was just another lowborn and would be kicked out of the house soon enough anyway, so don't feel sorry for her. She began to clean up the dirty water and cried all the time. Lucy in turn smiled and looked at Veronica, saying that it was so boring without her, and this little girl was entertaining them instead. Veronica said nothing to that. For a while they just stood there, staring at each other, but then she walked over and punched the maid right in the face. Lucy, of course, disliked all this very much. She looked at the girl with disgust and asked, "What is the meaning of all this?" However, Veronica stood with her head held high, unwilling to make excuses for someone like her. The maid kept shouting at the mistress, asking, "Has she gone mad? What does she think she's doing?" Hilda, for her part, realized that it was better not to see this little girl, so she offered to go with her, for the screams continued, and she did not know what might be next. Lucy continued to be indignant, and asked what the girl was even thinking when she decided to slap her. But Veronica didn't say anything to that, just slapped her a second time. After the girl was finally silent, she asked, "Has Lucy really lost her mind?" and also advised her to watch her expressions. She also added that, as she can see, the girl is still bullying defenseless children who can't do anything to her in return. Veronica also said that if it happened again, a slap would be the last thing she would worry about, so she should think about her behavior. Luce was incredibly indignant when she heard all this, and couldn't believe that it was really Veronica, who not long ago had been lowering her head and apologizing for any transgression. She looked at the adult lady in front of her and didn't understand what had happened to her, for the girl had always been obedient and never raised her voice. Lucy even thought for a moment that it was a completely different person standing in front of her. But as she left, she said that they would see. When the Earl came back, she would tell him everything, and they would see who would be the winner. She also suggested that the girl meet in the punishment room, just like 14 years ago. But Veronica replied in a calm voice that she didn't care at all about her ridiculous threats. She answered the girl in a cold voice that she wasn't afraid of her at all, so she might as well not even waste her energy on her childish threats. She then went over to Hilda and the little girl, who was still sitting there crying, and inquired if she was all right. She immediately came up to her and, putting her arm around her, told her that she must be shaking. She couldn't believe that it was Lucia who was bullying a poor and defenseless child. However, at this moment, she suddenly looked into the girl's eyes and saw a bright red color there. She immediately recognized those eyes, all because they were the same color as Count Schumann's. This frightened and surprised Veronica beyond belief. Then the girl realized that she was not just an adopted daughter, but was surely Count Schumann's blood child, which meant that this little girl was now her sister. Soon Veronica changed her clothes and brought her into the room. She sat down across from her and asked if she was all right. She immediately smiled and offered to treat her wound so it wouldn't hurt so much and it would soon be healed. The little girl didn't say a word. Then Veronica began to touch her head wound, and the girl immediately began to crouch down and be afraid. Veronica was very surprised that she flinched at any touch, and then she asked the girl if she could recognize her name at least. The girl said in a trembling voice that she was Daisy and asked to be called that. All the while she continued to cry and shake with fear. Veronica couldn't look away from those bright red eyes. In this world, blood-red irises are only found in Grayson's house, and she especially noticed them in the direct heirs. This means that there was a younger sister in the real Veronica. However, there was not a single word about her in the novel. But now, when the girl looks at her, she immediately thinks of her little sister from her past life, her dear Yuja. She is incredibly sorry that the girl died too soon, never seeing the world and leaving her alone. Then Veronica hugged poor Daisy, saying she hoped they would get along, and also introduced herself. The little girl in turn was very surprised. Then she moved away from the lady and, looking her straight in the eye, asked, "Is she really that Veronica?" She looked back at Daisy in surprise and asked, "Does the girl really know her?" She huddled even more on the blanket and said she'd heard a lot about her. She was said to be incredibly beautiful. Daisy also said with a smile on her face that she was indeed as she had imagined her to be. Veronica smiled and said as she placed her hand on hers and pulled her closer, telling her that she was also her sister. Soon afterward, the girl packed up and went into town with Hilda and Daisy. The maid insisted and said it was too risky. She said they mustn't do that, for the guards might notice their absence at any moment. And besides, the Count might suddenly return. However, Veronica went ahead and said that she had nothing to worry about, because her father would be gone for a long time. Moreover, she and Daisy needed new clothes, so they just had to go to town. But there was another reason why they were going to the dressmaker. Veronica turned suddenly to her sister and asked her how she was feeling, for she looked rather pale. The girl, taking off her hood, replied that she was just a little embarrassed that everyone could see her ugly face, so she wanted to hide from everyone. When Veronica heard this, she was very surprised and couldn't understand what these maids had done to her in the first place and what humiliations they had spoken, since she thought of herself that way now. Then the girl took off her hat and, putting it on Daisy, said it was all nonsense. It was just empty words, but if she was really uncomfortable, she could wear the hat. It would protect her from the sun. She smiled and also said that she could keep it and consider it her first gift from her big sister. Daisy looked at her in surprise and couldn't believe her happiness. Then she ran up to her to hug her in gratitude. But at that moment, the wind suddenly began to blow hard, and the hat flew away. The girl immediately ran after it, saying she had to catch it. But Veronica suddenly saw her run straight out into the road and started yelling for her to be careful. At this point, the coachman who was driving the wagon began to lose control because he was trying not to run over this girl. The man was very surprised and told his horses to stop now. Then the animals started to shout loudly, but the cart stopped. When Veronica opened her eyes, she immediately began to look for her sister, and soon saw that she had been rescued by a man. She immediately ran up to Daisy asking if she was okay and also if she was in pain. Then she looked more closely at the man, who was trying to comfort the girl with words, hugging her and telling her everything was fine. Daisy in turn continued to shake. She was incredibly frightened. When he saw Veronica, he immediately wondered, is she really the guardian of this child? The girl didn't have time to answer anything, because the little girl immediately ran to meet her. She tearfully began to apologize to her for losing her gift. She also said that she would never lose anything again. She really promised that, and tearfully talked about how sorry she was. Veronica immediately hugged her sister and said that it was just a hat and she shouldn't apologize for it. More importantly, she had almost been run over and could have been badly hurt. She then got to her feet and looked at the man, who began to chip away at the mud, and said that they should thank the young man who had saved her. Then she immediately walked over to him and just stared at him for a while. Veronica immediately realized it was him. The man in his line lowered his head in greeting and said it was very good that the child was safe now. Veronica knew exactly who this man was. It's a guy named Evan Ron Blake. He is the cold-blooded Duke of the Adrian Empire. He has a rather menacing look, just like his titles. Evan was the second main male character in this novel. The girl was a little alarmed that she was able to meet the two of them so soon. It wasn't the same as in the original story. The events unfolded quite differently than in the original story. The man in turn told the lady to be more careful next time and to watch the children. As he turned around and left, Evan also added that the neighborhood is just filled with various carriages, and it is dangerous even for adults, let alone children, in this place. Veronica stood silent for a while. Then turning to him, she wondered where he was going just like that. Evan turned around and looked at her and said he still had urgent business to attend to, so he had to leave right away. But the girl said that his arm was badly injured. He looked at her and said that it wasn't really anything serious. Veronica was indignant and said it was very serious. After all, he was even bleeding, and he needed help immediately, because he might catch some serious virus. But the man in turn was very serious and said that everything would be fine. If fate allowed, they would meet again. But now he said goodbye to her, and just left. Now Veronica began to realize why Evan was so popular. She herself had just succumbed to his charms. Soon afterward, they finally went to a clothing store, and Daisy tried on one of the dresses. Veronica admired it, and said it was an incredible color for her. The girl herself felt very uncomfortable, and wondered if there were really any clothes that looked beautiful on her. Veronica replied that of course it was a dress, as if it had been made for her. Then she turned to the dressmaker, and asked if it could be hemmed. The woman smiled and said absolutely. Then she turned around and said that she would call the owner to settle the matter. Then Hilda suddenly ran up to her and told the girl in her ear that they had no money with them, after all, and wondered what she was going to do then. Veronica smiled and said that she didn't have to worry about it, because she had already thought of everything. So she had everything under control. But Hilda was simply furious. She did not understand how she could not be worried, for indeed they had no money with them to pay for such expensive dresses. At that moment, a woman who introduced herself as Eloise came into the room and said that she was the owner of the store. She asked how she could help them. The woman moved closer and said that she had been told they would need to file something. But as soon as she took a closer look, she recognized Veronica and froze in place, unable to believe her eyes. The girl looked at her in surprise, and the lady in her turn smiled and said it was a pleasure to meet her. She also said her name and that she was from House Grayson. It was now clear to Veronica why Eloise, the shopkeeper, had reacted like that at the sight of her. She supposed it was likely that the woman remembered something from the past. After all, long ago Eloise had once been the mistress of an impoverished house, and had been sold to an old aristocrat for very little money. He kept cursing at her and telling her that she should behave in a decent manner, as befits a woman. And Eloise, in turn, somehow managed to get out of that house, realizing that she had to get as far away as possible. The Countess and Veronica's father were the ones who miraculously rescued her. They saw the girl collapsed in the bushes, completely exhausted. Her father, when he saw her in turn, was very surprised and asked who could have done such a thing to her, and she had many bruises and scratches all over her body. The girl in turn replied that she needed warm clothes, so she took off her cloak and gave it to the poor girl. She smiled, and putting her hand on her shoulder told her they would help her. Eloise was Veronica's mother, her savior. In fact, Eloise looks like a perfectly ordinary owner of this store, but in fact she is a tycoon who controls the trade on Roosevelt Street. In this place, she is an incognito who is trying to find Veronica's mother, her savior. The girl assumed that if she becomes her ally, it will be quite profitable. The purchases were soon made, and the shopkeeper said they would deliver the dress to their estate. Veronica, along with her sister and the maid, came out to go on their way, but then suddenly the shopkeeper ran out after them and told them to wait for a while. Then she asked if they would ever come to their store again. Veronica smiled and said that of course they would visit her again. In fact, for the girl to cooperate with Eloise would be a great advantage in all cases. Then the shopkeeper, smiling, said that in that case, they would see each other again, and she would be very happy to meet them again. After that, they went on with their business, and Eloise, looking at Veronica, thought that this young lady must have something to do with her, and she had at last a chance to do her duty. She then turned to her store employee and asked to find out all about the Grayson house. The woman said they would find out everything right away and comply. Veronica, along with her sister and the maid, walked farther and farther away. The girl thought about the fact that her presence at Grayson Manor had changed the course of events completely. She realized that she needed to figure out her next steps to explore the plan. This day was the beginning of a good ending for her. It was not until evening came that the girls finally made their way back to the manor. Hilda walked behind, and all the time wary, she said something was wrong. The maid replied that she too had thought they would be greeted by angry guards, Surprisingly, however, the manor was completely quiet. Even Daisy was uncomfortable with the atmosphere. But at that moment, one of the maids suddenly came up to her, smiled, and told her that she was back at last. The girl stepped closer to her, and reaching forward said they were expecting her, and added that she would show her to the dining room. Veronica had changed by then, and went to the room where Lucy and the other maids were waiting for her. The maid said with a strained smile that she was truly sorry for what had happened earlier, and she added that they had prepared a delicious dinner for her to make it up to her. She pointed with her hand to the table, on which stood a huge chicken roasting in the oven, and wished her a good appetite, and told her to eat before it all cooled. At that moment, Veronica remembered that the last time the maids had prepared food for her, it had been so awful that the girl had even had to spit it out. Along with the others, mocked and talked about how sorry she was, because they had cooked it especially for her, and made the girl eat every last spoonful. Seeing the expression on the lady's face, Lucy suddenly wondered, was something wrong and she didn't like this dinner? Veronica looked at her and said nothing, then wondered if she really thought it was all that funny. The maid looked surprised, and then wondered what she was talking about, since she hadn't done anything like that. Veronica, still not touching the food, said that she knew that she understood. After all, Lucy must have had a wonderful time making this dish. So she asked the maid why not join her and enjoy this fine meal with her. When Lucy heard this, she immediately panicked. She turned to Mistress and asked what she even meant. The girl in turn replied that she understood everything correctly, for she was sharing with the maid this wonderful dinner. Lucy still stood back and didn't know what to do. She said she did not quite understand what Mistress wanted, for this dinner was for her. Veronica, in turn, smiling evilly, said that she spoke as if the food had been poisoned, and that was why she didn't want to try it. The maid, laughing nervously, said it was all nonsense. If she thinks the food is poisoned, it's perfectly fresh and ready to eat. Veronica said that she, too, thought it was all nonsense. Then, smiling, she turned to Lucy and said that she was incredibly sorry that this time things were not going as she had planned. She, sighing heavily, also said that Earl Grayson had once nearly died of poisoning, and wondered what would have happened if he had seen it all. Veronica also said that he never forgives those involved in all this. The other maids began to address Lucy at once, saying that she had not told them anything about it, and inquired what would happen if the Count did find out about it. The girl immediately started yelling at them and told them they were idiots, and at that moment she herself realized that her suspicions were justified. It was Veronica who was completely different from what she knew her to be. Veronica, for her part, was very pleased. She realized that Lucy's tactic was mixing sand with spices and seasonings, and the girl who didn't know about it before always ate food with sand and didn't even suspect anything. Then Veronica turned to the maid and said that she might not worry, for she would not tell her father, but she would have one condition. She said Lucy must eat all the food she had so cheerfully prepared for her. The girl thought about the fact that, unfortunately for Lucy, she was no longer the intimidated girl like in the original story, so she was going to stand up for her rights and interests. Veronica thought it was her turn to suffer, so she wished her a pleasant appetite. Lucy, in turn, began to carry her spoon to her mouth with a trembling hand. At that moment, however, a woman came into the room and asked the maid to stop. She immediately inquired what the commotion was about. The woman said it was her responsibility to oversee the kitchen in this house. Veronica, when she looked at her, immediately recognized it was Merida. The woman came closer to the lady and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and apologized for not meeting her sooner, because the estate had quite a lot of things to deal with. She looked her in the face and apologized. Veronica, for her part, realized that it was all a lie, because she hadn't met her on purpose. This girl was the head maid. Merida was also Schumann's right hand, and kept an eye on everything that happened in the house. She was the one who drove her mom to her death. And also all these years she had mercilessly tormented poor Veronica, bullying her. Then the woman turned to her and said that she would be brief. If she did not like the dinner, she should deal directly with the cooks, not with the maids. And at that moment she pushed a bowl of soup down with her hand. Lucy, for her part, exhaled in relief, and then replied that Lady Merida was indeed right, and she appeared to be mad at the wrong people. She thought to herself that she'd done the right thing by being yelled at. She thought she was just a stupid girl who didn't deserve anything more. Lucy thought that no one cared about Veronica in this place. The girl herself was very indignant at such behavior and did not understand how they could allow themselves to do such things. She was silent for a while, then told Marita that she must be right. As soon as Veronica was out of the door, she was immediately met by Hilda. She explained to the maid that she would go and ask the chief to replace that food. Then the doors slammed shut and the maids were left alone. At that moment, the head maid came up to Lucy and grabbed her hair so hard that she even started screaming loudly. She was incredibly angry and didn't understand how she dared to contradict her. Veronica, of course, assumed that Marita might intervene. She continued with her plan, however, because she had a good reason to go to the kitchen. Soon the girl came into the kitchen and apologized for disturbing them, but said she wouldn't be long. Considering Eloise, the girl was about to gain another ally for herself, namely a new chef. So Veronica approached the man, asking if it was correct that he was the new chef and his name was Bruno. He looked rather stern, but said that was correct. And then they had a rather interesting conversation ahead of them. Meanwhile, in the palace of the Empire, Adrian Lowen sat on his veranda drinking wine. Evan was also sitting not far from him, and he said it was an incredibly bright night, and he had just recently seen hair that shone just like that moonlight. He sighed and said it was an incredible beauty, and he still can't forget that girl. Then he turned to Evan and said he was grateful for even the briefest meeting, for he was known for avoiding such social events. The man explained that this was not an event at all, and he was only there because His Majesty had requested his presence, nothing more. At this point, the man who was standing below said that it was a rather rare sight to see these two together. He explained that they were both potential heirs to the throne. He said in a stern voice that it didn't matter to him at all who would eventually become the emperor, because in the end, it would still be himself who ruled. Bruno was actually the chef who was responsible for all the food at Earl Grayson's estate. He may seem like an ordinary cook at first glance, but he is actually the leader of the Caddis mercenaries. Caddis is also known as the Hidden Battalion. 10 years ago, after learning of Earl Grayson's involvement in his brother's murder, he returned to this estate seeking revenge. Bruno looked rather stern and said the room seemed rather noisy and wondered if there was something wrong with the food there. The girl replied that it was not important because she wanted to talk to him about something. The man was immediately interested and asked her what she wanted to talk about. Then Veronica replied to Bruno that she knew everything and asked if they could go somewhere more private to talk things over. The man agreed, and they came to the pantry. The girl said that she was not really asking for anything in return, but just wanted him to know that she shared his pain. Veronica said that she understood perfectly well what he had come to the manor for. After all, he had a dear person whom he could not let go, and she, like him, hated the Count with all her heart. That's why she asks him to help her get back at him properly. Bruno looked at her in surprise and said he didn't know what she was talking about. Then he turned around and started to walk away, saying that the sudden dialogue about hatred and revenge was completely inappropriate since he was only the chef in the kitchen. That's why he thinks she should leave before she says too much. Veronica actually expected this reaction, because it's only natural that he's cautious. So she asked that he listen to her, for this conversation was about Earl Grayson. The girl turned her head to the side and saw that it was the head maid. She turned her head to the side and saw that it was the head maid. The woman said that Earl Grayson had already returned, so she advised her to go meet him. All the servants went outside to greet the Earl, and the head maid bowed and said that they were very glad to welcome him home again, and added that they had been waiting for his arrival. She then asked if his trip had been comfortable and if everything had gone well. The man, in turn, going inside, replied that he was very tired, so he did not want to discuss anything. At that moment, Veronica came up to him and told him that he had finally returned. She bowed and said that it had been a long time since they had last spoken, and she thought it would be better to join him for dinner and talk a little. He looked at his daughter skeptically, and without even saying hello, he simply walked past her, tapping her on the shoulder. He didn't care at all about the words she said. Before he completely distanced himself, the man said that she was annoying him, as always, and also added that it was pretty brave of her after 5 years back. The man asked when he had ever allowed her to join him for dinner. He was very indignant and said that she always gets on his nerves, so he asks that she just get out of his sight. The older maid who was following him immediately smiled when she heard this, She was very pleased that at least someone would finally put this Veronica in her place again. Veronica didn't say anything, but just stood there, watching her father walk farther and farther away. She was incredibly angry with him for treating her like this. The older maid, for her part, said she would like to talk about her letter, but the man replied that they would discuss it later. For now he would prefer to be alone. Soon afterward, Veronica was alone with Bruno, and turning to him, inquired whether he now believed her at least. She also said that she hated him with all her soul as much as he hated himself. So for her to take revenge on her father would be the best act in the world. The man just stared at her for a while, and Veronica said she really needed his help. When evening came, the Count came to dinner. He was immediately met there by Bruno, who prepared all the food. The man, upon seeing him, immediately said hello and said he was sorry for what had happened to his brother, because he was a most good chef. Also, the man, while cutting off his piece of steak, said that he believes the ability to cook is in their blood, so Bruno will be no worse than his brother. Just as the man was about to take a bite of meat, Bruno suddenly turned to him and told him that there was an extra appetizer attached to this day and he would like his opinion on it. When the Count heard this, he was immediately interested. In fact, Veronica said she needed the man to distract Schumann for as long as possible for her plan to work. She actually had something she needed to find, so there was no way her father was going to be back in the office early. And so while Bruno was serving dinner to her father, she was in his office, looking among 1,000 different folders for what she needed. The girl knew it had to be in there somewhere, but she couldn't find it. It had to be the clue to the sacred sword. In fact, the sacred sword is a treasure of the Hadrian Empire, and many talk of it even being forged from God's tears. Legend has it that even emperors must bow to its power, and Count Grayson has committed many atrocities in an attempt to obtain this very sword, and he wrote it all down in one secret journal. It was a kind of personal diary, which he was going to reread later on and see if he had made any mistakes in his business. And now Veronica was looking for it. She knew she had to find out about all the crimes in his diary and find the sword before he did. At that moment, when she suddenly pulled out one of the books, she noticed a small claptrap of paper. She immediately realized that it was some kind of special note. The girl realized that this was quite important information, so she immediately ran towards the dining room, taking it in her hands, and she wanted to tell Bruno all of this. However, just as Veronica was about to leave, the door suddenly opened and Count Schumann, her father, appeared. The man just stood staring at her for a while, saying nothing. In fact, he politely declined the appetizer. He said he had urgent business to attend to after dinner, so he offered to save it for next time, and ate his portion contentedly. That's why Veronica didn't even have time to leave his office. The man looked angrily at his daughter and asked what she was even doing there. When he saw the book in her hands, he said it was pretty brazen of her to go behind his back like that. The girl was silent for a while, and then said that she was really just waiting for him, and smiled to make it sound as believable as possible. When the Count heard this, he was very surprised. He went inside and told his daughter that she had changed incredibly in all these 5 years. After all, she even had the courage to answer him with anything at all. Veronica tried to keep herself calm. She realized that this was the moment she had dreamed of for so long, because she was no longer afraid of her father and was able to fight back. Veronica then replied that she had come to his office because she had something to tell him. The girl turned to her father and said that the place where she lived was just amazingly green. The girl turned to her father and said that the place where she lived was amazingly green, and it was as if her heart had been healed, and it made her think about all the things she had done. She said that she had been incredibly stupid and treated him completely disrespectfully, so from now on she wants to be the daughter who can always help him. The man listened to her for a while and was silent. Then he laughed and asked if she really thought she could help him. However, on second thought, he also added that perhaps she could be useful somewhere. When he came closer, he touched her face and said that with age, she had become even more like her late mother. Veronica looked at him in disgust and didn't understand how he even dared to mention her. But then suddenly he turned around and said that they would talk about her help a little later, and advised her not to forget that he could take her life at any moment. He'll do it just like he did to her mother, so she can have no doubt he'll go for it. When Veronica heard this, she was angry and thought it was disgusting and vile. She began to curse him mentally, and didn't understand how such a man could be her father. Shortly afterward, the girl went outside, contemplating what had happened just a short time ago. Veronica then managed to search the entire office, but in the end she found no information about the sacred sword, not even the slightest mention of it. Instead, she found some of the Count's secret money transactions. So she took one of the papers and immediately handed it to Bruno. She said it was her gift to him as a thank you, and also advised him to look into the 7th port area of Horton. There he could find the key to the attack on Schumann. The man waved his head, said he believed her, so he would do it that way. She managed to gain Brun's complete trust and solidarity. That's why now it was time for Veronica to learn about Schumann's other weaknesses. Soon the girl went in a wagon to one very interesting place. Just as she came out, she was immediately met by some man and told that he was very glad to see her. It was the manager of the shelter she had come to, and he said that her visit was a great honor to them, and asked that she let him escort her inside. Veronica arrived at the Navier Special Orphanage. This is the place that has been maintained for years by Schumann. It was also a shelter for children whose parents had died in the war. As soon as they got inside, the man sat down opposite her and said that she had surprised him very much, for it was an unexpected but still pleasant visit. Veronica in turn got emotional and said that she really hoped she hadn't interrupted them in any way. The man replied that not at all. It was a great honor for them, and the kids would all be thrilled when they saw her. He didn't say anything for a while. I told him that he didn't like to talk about business when we first met, but now he had to, because the orphanage was going through some difficult times. He suddenly covered his face with his hands, and crying, said that if it had not been for the Count's support, he dreaded to think what might have happened to all those children. Veronica, in turn, suddenly noticed his hand, on which there was a beautiful gold bracelet with many precious stones. She realized that this bracelet stood out from the overall layout and ambiance around her, so it alerted her immediately. Then the man decided to get right to the point and asked how much she planned to donate to their orphanage. But Veronica rose from her seat and replied that if she could, she would like to meet the children. The manager was a little surprised to hear this request, but said that of course she could see them. Soon she was ushered into one of the rooms. There she was immediately met by one incredibly beautiful little girl with bright pink hair. When she saw Veronica, she immediately ran up to her and told her that she was an incredibly beautiful girl. Lots of different children were flanking her from different directions, and they showered her with compliments, saying that she was very beautiful, kind, and sweet. One of the girls said she was glowing with beauty, and also asked if she would play a game with them. Veronica, in turn, without stopping smiling, told them to wait for a while, and suggested that they take turns speaking. Since she had a hard time recognizing who meant what, she kept laughing in front of them. But she realized herself that these children were pretty thin, their clothes were all dirty, and they had scars on their cheeks. Veronica realized that the children in this place were being bullied directly, just as Daisy had been bullied in her home. But at that moment, the pink-haired girl was suddenly very upset and even frightened. She immediately ran to Veronica and hugged her. The girl was suddenly alert, not sure what she was so frightened about, and she wondered what she had seen. But when she turned her head to the side, she saw the orphanage manager standing near the door. It was immediately obvious to her that the money the orphanage received was not being used for the needs of all those children. She immediately remembered the notebook in which she had found various notes on corruption. It was incredibly hard for her to realize this, but then suddenly a boy came running up to them in tears and said he wanted help. The child explained that Reina couldn't climb down from the tree, and she would thus hurt herself if she even just tried. When Veronica heard this, she immediately ran to his aid. She told him not to move, and Reina was sitting on top of him, shaking with fear. Many children from the orphanage gathered around her, and they all tried to calm her down, telling her not to worry. They would soon help her down. Veronica in turn looked up and noticed that it was too high and quite dangerous, but the girl kept crying and talking about how she was incredibly scared. When she moved her foot and almost fell over because the branch started to crack right under her body. Veronica realized that she had no choice left, so she began to tie her dress. After all, she just didn't have time to wait. She needed to get upstairs as soon as possible and save this little girl. But just as she was about to do it, a man suddenly touched her shoulder. When she turned to the side, she saw Evan, who asked her to let him do it. He looked serious and said that she couldn't climb that high because it was too dangerous. Veronica was surprised, because she had not expected to see him at the shelter.